Okay, welcome back everybody. The time is now 3:30 Eastern, 12:30 Pacific, and we are going to get started on the final part of today's session, which runs until 5 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Pacific. And this is our panel discussion featuring Micah Peace from Louisville, Kentucky, Rami Jodri from Central North Carolina, and Connie Senior from New York City. And I'm now going to hand this over to Jill, who is going to moderate this panel discussion. Thank you and welcome, Jill, and our panelists.
Thank you, Beth. So we are delighted this afternoon to have Connie and Micah and Rami and Dave to join us for the panel. I will be serving as moderator and asking some questions. I think we're going to have the chat closed for this portion, but if we have time at the end, we will open it up for folks if they have additional questions. So I'm going to start with just asking our panelists, Connie, Mike, and Rami, to introduce themselves and just a little bit about why they're here and what role they serve. So let's start with Connie.
Hi, my name is Connie Senior, and I am the Assistant Director of Training at YAI. I've been at YAI for 23 years. I also oversee our sexuality education program. And this is something a topic that I'm extremely passionate about. I also help to develop curriculum and trained under the awesome Perry Samowitz and Barbara Fine. One of the reasons that this topic is so passionate to me is my uncle had Down syndrome. I did not know he had Down syndrome. I'm from Jamaica originally. And my grandmother told us that he came from England, he didn't wear shoes, and that's why he was how he was. When I went to YI, I walked in a room and I saw 7 people who looked like my Uncle Paul, except some were Caucasian, some were Asian. And so I felt something wasn't right. And I called my grandmother. And that's when I discovered that my uncle had Down syndrome. I knew that if I had the opportunity, he passed about a year after I got here. And I never had the opportunity to bring him here. But I knew if he came here, because he was a ladies' man who was not really allowed to express his sexuality. He was punished. He had to hide his girly magazines. And I just knew that he would have had such an awesome life. And sexuality is important to me personally, because I believe as women, we've been repressed, and I've been passionate about it, but particularly for people with intellectual disabilities. And when I came to YAI and found a place that recognized that sexual rights are human rights, and that people with intellectual disabilities they're being violated, their rights are being taken from them, and they were fighting for those rights, I realized I was in the right place. And 17 years later, I am so thankful and extremely, even more so passionate to ensure that we're teaching people that sexual rights are human rights and everyone has the right to express themselves sexually.
Thank you, Connie. And as some of you probably are aware, YI does operate a couple of three START programs. And I know the START programs have also been the recipient of some of your knowledge. And so that's been very helpful. We really appreciate you being here with us today.
Thank you.
And Rami.
Yeah, hi. My name is Rami Jodri, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs. I live in Durham, North Carolina, and I'm the therapeutic coaching team lead for the NC START Central program. I'm also a licensed clinical mental health counselor. And the topic of this panel is very important to me, both personally and professionally. So I identify as a queer, non-binary transgender person, and I grew up in an environment where those identities were not supported or affirmed. So since I hold those experiences of struggling for acceptance, it's been really important to me to do educational work like this panel and various trainings, and also support work with queer and transgender youth. But this panel is also doubly important to me because I received a diagnosis myself of autism spectrum disorder when I was working on my undergraduate degree. And since then, I've done a lot of work as an autistic self-advocate, and I went into this field specifically due to my belief that it's incredibly important for autistic people receiving services to have the option of working with an autistic provider. So because I navigate the intersections of disability, sexuality, and gender every day, it's really exciting to be a part of a panel that's also exploring those intersections.
Thank you, Rami. Thanks for being here. I meant to say earlier that people didn't exactly volunteer to be on this panel, but everybody eagerly agreed to participate. So we're really happy with that. So Micah.
Hi everyone, my name is Micah Peace and I'm from Louisville, Kentucky. I'm a teacher at an inclusive school. I teach 2nd and 3rd grade, and I'm also an autistic self-advocate and community organizer. Like our fellow panelist, Rami, I too see this as very important on both a professional and a personal level. I grew up with a very, we'll say sheltered education about sexuality and about relationships. And that caused me to have some negative experiences later on in my life. Now knowing who I am and what my disabilities are, I make it a point to speak candidly about the things that I've been through and the things that I've learned, so that others who are like me can both know that it is okay to be different and to share your story, and so that they can learn from the mistakes that I made so that they don't have to.
Thank you, Micah. And again, appreciate all the panelists today.
Can I just add that Micah is also on our research team, and I would like to just, she hardly ever says that. So, I mean, they hardly ever say that, and I just want to make sure they are acknowledged for being a researcher.
That is also true. Thank you, Joni. I do forget about that often, but I'm on the leadership team for a wonderful study called Truth and Reconciliation. And I would argue that that has repercussions for gender and sexuality as well.
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Micah. And
do you mind if I take a shot at this too?
Yeah, I was just going to say, go ahead, because we probably have some people who may have joined us this afternoon that didn't join us this morning.
Yeah, and I know that I got all that time to speak this morning, but from a really personal point of view, this subject matters to me because I'm 68 years old. I came out when I was 16, which was pre-Stonewall, which is when I met my boyfriend, now husband. And so we've been together for 52 years. But the early years of our relationship, we were actually illegal because in the Criminal Code of Canada had not yet been changed to recognize the LGBT community and recognize our rights to exist in the world without it being a crime, just to be who we were. And that puts an indelible image into your head when you grow up and you know your difference. And not only are you different, your difference is criminalized. And the level of fear that Joe and I had that we could be caught at any time and we could be forced into treatment and forced into, we lived with terror for so many years. And then I come to work for a system that is a system sometimes of terror for people with disabilities in much the same way. And I would argue that my status as a member of the LGBT community has made me better at my job because I understand difference and I understand prejudice and I understand people who under-expect. And so I think that when I look at my own sexuality, I see it as something that benefits the work that I do rather than detracts from. So I was very excited when you approached me to have this discussion because we do really need to make sure that nobody grows up believing that their love is a crime.
Thank you, Dave. So kind of following with what you all have shared, one of the questions we have is around what are the important considerations when we're thinking about the intersection of sexuality, disability, race? What are some of the important considerations we need to have as service providers? Amy, okay, Connie, you want to start? Okay.
I think one thing to remember, and Dave had alluded to it, right? That discrimination is discrimination is discrimination. And so we have to be careful that we don't help one and forget about the other aspects of discrimination and cover discrimination on a whole, that it's not okay. And using empathy, really, empathizing and realizing that people are lonely, people are hurt. It hurts. Word hurt. We grew up hearing sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Not true. Words hurt and they leave a deeper scar. You just don't see it, and because it's inside. I think as service providers, when we talk about person-centered and we talk about person-driven, is that we need to consider the entire person. Often we think health and safety first, but we don't think real personhood. So I think it's more of, are we thinking along that spectrum and looking at the entire person and not just the pieces that are safer?
Thank you, Connie.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that I think thinking about intersectionality and intersecting identities is really important when we're working to be trauma informed, because of the way that systemic trauma is compounded when you have multiple marginalized identities. So just being mindful of the fact that people who have a disability and are also part of the LGBTQ community are going to be experiencing higher rates of trauma just from like the systemic discrimination that you experience from ableism, from homophobia, from transphobia, and then obviously adding in intersections of race and gender just kind of compounds all of that as well, and opens up the person to experiencing multiple forms of other trauma, like for example, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are far more likely to experience higher rates of sexual abuse. People who have disabilities and aren't accepted by their family members for being LGBTQ have higher rates of mental illness, of suicide attempts. So there's all of these factors that kind of combine, and I think it's really important for providers to consider the impact of all of that trauma on them and their presentations.
Thank you, Ramey. I think that's we from the START perspective talk a lot about trauma-informed care and the importance of that. And I think maybe primarily we think about it from the perspective of the disability, but I think you make a great point of the intersection of all those parts that we need to consider. Micah, do you have anything else to add?
Ramey said what I was going to say much better than I could have.
Anything else to add then? You're good? So Dave, do you have any reflections on that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we can think about is the power of language and the power of honesty. What I find, in particular, I don't know whether this is true in the United States, but particularly in Canada, we're such a polite people. And people don't want to call out and name racism, and people don't want to call out and name homophobia, and people don't want to call out and name transphobia. People just don't want to do that. But I think it's really important that people who are a discriminated group understand what the language is that expresses the nature of their oppressor. And the nature of what their experience is. Because when somebody is being exploited or mistreated or purposely misunderstood because of their race, I think it's really important that we mention racism and educate people about racism. And if people are experiencing violent homophobia, I think they need to hear those words. And people will say, oh, those words are too complex. No, they're not. No, they're not. And the concepts behind them aren't either. So I think it's important when people are standing at intersections that they're informed about the language of their experience, because it's really hard to come forward and speak about experiencing sort of racist attitudes without the understanding of race and racism And I think it's impossible to come forward and to speak about homophobia without the language to use regarding that. So I think it's important that we verbally discuss with people using the language that they need to learn. Because I know that was really helpful for me particularly as a young gay man. The first time I remember really clearly, the first time I learned the word homophobia, and I would have been in my 20s. And I want you to know the impact that that label had on the behavior of other people was absolutely profound. And it gave me a language that I could talk about my own experience in a way that could communicate the very real effects of what it was to be at the blunt end of other people's attitudes.
Thank you, Dave. And I think the language part and the name, we can't really address these issues unless we name them, right? We have to.
That's right. That's right.
Thank you.
But people don't want to name them.
Right.
And they don't want to because people don't want to admit to racism.
Right.
You know, people don't want to admit to homophobia. Oh, no. It's just that I have these concerns. You know, it's always prejudice wrapped in concern.
Right.
We're really good at lying to ourselves in human services.
Thank you. Okay.
That's called identity protective cognition, and you should examine yourselves for it as well. Times when if someone else is saying that something that you're doing or saying to them is wrong or doesn't resonate with them, many people get defensive. We find this is another reason people don't want to bring up racism or call it out, because if someone says, you're being racist, they say, no, I'm not. I love Black people, or something ignorant.
I have Black friends.
Yeah, exactly. And it's an unwillingness to look at oneself and to interrogate one's own biases that they're coming in with. This is work that you're very likely to grow whilst doing, and don't be afraid of doing that.
Thank you, Mike. And I think from yesterday from Tawara Good, we heard that same message around you can't understand another person's culture unless you understand your own. You first have to understand your own culture and where you're coming from. Mm-hmm. So Michael, while we have you, I'll move to the next question. What are some of the most common myths around sexual or gender identity and IDD that you've heard?
I've experienced many. As Dave alluded to, some often say that these kinds of concepts are too complicated or too adult for people like me, or that people with IDD don't have these dimensions to their identity, or that when we express these dimensions of our identity, that it's inherently related to our disability, aka that it's pathological. When I discovered masturbation as a young teenager, as many young people do, it was a big deal because it was like a behavior, but it's a natural milestone that many people grow through.
Some of us are still there.
And people think that these things are inherently problematic or inappropriate just because we have disabilities. But what's really happening, I suspect, is that you're being made uncomfortable, that you weren't ready for us to go through that. I've also heard a lot of, well, they're not ready for that until they meet X independent living goal, or until their mental health is better. And to me, this sounds kind of like the whole, you gotta love yourself before you can love somebody else fallacy. Mutually loving and caring relationships are healing. And you don't need to be perfect before you can love someone else. In fact, many people grow and find support through these kinds of relationships. My partner and I are both autistic, and in many kinds of ways, we have a really good like yin yang thing going on. We support each other in areas where we're not able to. but people also kind of have this notion that people with disabilities, particularly intellectual or developmental disabilities, that we don't have a desire for love or for romantic relationships, or that we're not capable of having them and being reciprocal. Or they think, oh, we're too simple for that. Like, that's not necessary for us to have a fulfilling life. But loving and caring relationships are necessary for everyone to some degree. And so I think those are the main ones that I have encountered.
Thank you, Micah. I think the thing that kind of stuck out to me was you saying people setting up these arbitrary criteria, like you need to know how to do this before you can do this. So before you can be in a relationship, you have to do this. And those criteria aren't set up for everybody, right? So why would you set those criteria, right?
And I've seen sometimes, I used to work at a center for independent living, and we did a lot of work with transitioning high schoolers. And I noticed often these arbitrary, as you've said, arbitrary goals are moving goalposts. They'll tell the person, oh, well, once you squash X behavior, you can do it. And then maybe they get that under control, but then they're like, oh, well, you really need to live independently before you can have relationships, or just, they'll move the goal. Right. So it becomes something that's always an aspiration and never a reality.
And could we please take the burden of people with disabilities always being in a relationship? It has to be a relationship. The idea that a person with disability wants to have a one-night stand absolutely drives us like off the wall. No, it must be in a committed relationship. It must be in a committed. Really? Like, how many of you? Well, I won't ask any of you, but it's just we set standards for people with disabilities that we have no intention of reaching.
Yeah.
You know, no intention. It's not for us. It's for them. And it just when you were talking, that made me think of that, like that those kinds of goalposts moving, and we set goals that are just absurd and unrealistic. You know, so now people with disabilities need to learn to be in relationships, but they get to learn, I think, that you can have a really, really good relationship in about 15 minutes and be done with it.
I think that points out, like you just said, the different standards we set for different people for some reason. So Rami, do you have some comments on this question about the common myths?
I feel like Micah touched on all of the ones that I had jotted down. I think maybe another one that I hear is related to not wanting to expose people with IDD to sex or sexual relationships because it's too risky. But I think we're going to touch on that one a little bit later. But I think there's this idea of like they are fragile and we need to protect them, and which kind of touches back on the thing that Micah was talking about like you're like either developmentally not there yet, or you need to do these other things first, or just kind of a lot of the infantilizing that we see of people with IDD and how that is used to gatekeep them from accessing sexual and romantic relationships.
Right. Thank you, Amy. And Connie, do you have some comments on that?
I think, a lot has been said. I think what I've seen a lot with staff is the concept that they just don't know better, or they're automatically thinking, they're not thinking intimacy, they're automatically thinking it's sex. It has to be sex. What about intimacy, which we know everyone needs intimacy. And that's the piece that, once I've seen like staff see two people holding hands, oh, gotta separate them because they're gonna have sex kind of concept, right? It's from a 0 to 100. And then the other piece is like what Dave said, I'm always training staff saying people with disabilities have the right to do everything we do. One night stand, multiple partners. If they want to orgy, As long as they know what they're doing and they've consented to what they're doing, they have the right to have a booty call, whatever it is, right? They have the same rights. And often we don't. We hold them at a higher standard than we hold ourselves.
Thank you. That's yeah, a good point. I'm glad you brought in the myths that staff sometimes bring into the situation too, for us to address.
Do you mind if I talk about parents a little bit here?
Mm-hmm.
I think I learned something from a parent that I did some work with, and she's now an advocate for people with disabilities to be sexual, and she will speak to parent groups and so forth. But when I met her, she said to me after hearing me speak, she said, "I don't think you understand what sexuality means to us as parents." And I was young enough that I thought I knew everything. So I said, "Well, I think it's a generational issue," and she got very upset. But when we talked about it, this is the story she told me, that when she gave birth to her child, she didn't even see her child. Doctors came to her and told her that her child was born a vegetable, that her child would need specialized care, that it's better off that she not even hold her child nor meet her child. It's better off that her child be signed into institutional care, and people would take care of her for the rest of her life. And she didn't do that. She didn't follow that. She brought the child home. But she said at a certain age, she started to have these feelings of grieving. And she said, "I don't know how you grieve a living child." But she spoke to a social worker who said, what you need to do is you need to grieve the loss of the normal future. You need to grieve the loss of the fact that she'll grow up, and the fact that she'll date, and the fact that she'll have children and get married, and all these milestones. You need to grieve the loss of that. And she said, that made sense to me, so I did. And then years later, when a social worker came to her to speak to her about her daughter's sexuality, only because her daughter had developed a boyfriend-girlfriend relationship, she threw him out of the house. She was so angry. She threw them out of the house. And she said, "Dave, you need to understand the child that could date and marry was dead. I had buried her, and I had mourned her, and I had moved on. And for me to accept what you're saying, that my daughter has the capacity to love another person in that way is she said, there needs to be almost a resurrection of hope." And she said, because it's how I see my child. And she said, and I kept my kid at home. Imagine I put my kid in the institution, and imagine you come to me years later and say that my kid wants to be in a relationship, and you told me that my child was a vegetable. You told me that my child had no future. And so the moment you tell me that my child has the capacity to love someone else, you have to understand that means I gave away a child who could have loved me. And to accept what you're saying will cause me such deep pain. And I hadn't actually looked at it that way, that we had burrowed in to the minds of parents prejudicial attitudes and a way of viewing their child. So I've always been very careful with parents, because I know that what they've been through and what their journey has often been just as problematic as the journey of a person with a disability themselves.
Thank you, Dave. I think it's a really important point, and I think it points to us as helpers, service providers, however we define ourselves, as thinking about those early years too. Like, she got that information early, but how important it is. Sometimes we talked about the importance of language this morning, and how important it is, the language that we use and how we support families. And from the beginning, not having people give up hope. I mean, that's should be there from the beginning. I think it says a lot to us as those who are in the service field. Thank you, Dave. So the next question, little related, but maybe a little more specific about how you all navigate this as people who are supporters. Sometimes the sexuality of the people we support is viewed as taboo or totally off limits. And we've kind of alluded to that already. So do you have strategies of how you've navigated this with families, with other service providers, of trying to make this not as off limits? Connie, you want to start with this one?
Yes, starting with staff, one of the things at YI is having a policy. And it's important for any agency to have a policy. Without a policy, everyone can interpret things in their own way, right? We're all coming with unconscious biases, things that have been embedded in us as we have been growing up without even being aware that it's there, right? We've talked about how much we think we know ourselves. So having a policy is one of the first things, and that acts as a guideline, right? One of the policies at YI is it doesn't matter what your thoughts and your views are. When you clock in, it is about you providing supports to that person for them to live the life the way they want to live their life. You don't have to agree with it. It's not your life, right? So it's also, so one of the things is helping people to realize that this is not about you. This is personal. So it's not about you personally. It's about the person you're supporting, and being able to kind of step back and see if we're talking about person-driven. Let's look at that person and let's look at what they want and let's support them. If you can't do it, then referring them to someone who can support them. And that's a huge piece. Having that policy is really huge, and putting those trainings in place and helping people to understand, because there are many people who come into the field and they want to care, they're caring, they want to help, right? And some are very motherly, and so they then take on that type of motherly role. So I know what's best for you, and that's not the case. It's that person's life. So one of the things is in training, in helping them to understand that it's really not about you. You don't have to like it because it's not you. And then with parents, I'm a psychotherapist, and I found a lot of times it's fair. It's a lot of fear for parents, but helping them to understand that the more, education is what helps with that fear. A child cannot report what they don't know is wrong. They're not going to report it if they don't know that this is something that is to be reported, right? So in giving information, that's when you can help them to then advocate, to be able to say no, to know what they need to say no for. So those two ways are two ways that we've been working to help people to understand, right? It's a sensitive topic, and one that people shy away from a lot because it's uncomfortable, like Micah said, but needs to be, addressed.
Transparency with your own staff, transparency of having policies and being clear on that. And then, like you said, the transparency in terms of sharing information with the people we're supporting, with people with disabilities.
Yes, and educating them, right? That's so important that they know, and teach them to advocate for themselves, and that it's okay to say no. Yeah. That's one thing we've also had to train staff, that it's okay. It's okay for them to say no. In fact, they need to say no to you.
Yes. Yeah.
Similar to as a mother, right? I'm a mother and a grandmother, and growing up, a child tells me, no, I'm going to be, are you nuts? You live under my roof. You do what I say. I was one of those parents. But as a staff member, they have the right to say no, and that we want them to know they can say no and actually say no. And staff need to figure out what they're going to do, but that's not the person's problem. That's you, staff problem.
Exactly. So Micah, do you have some perspectives on this?
So some ways that I try to navigate like the taboo aspects of this, or just how it can be uncomfortable for folks in a lot of different ways, are firstly that I name that it's uncomfortable for some folks. It does take the pressure off, I think, to just say, so like, we live in a community that can be kind of backward about this sometimes, or at home you might get shamed for this, but it's normal and you're fine. And in the similar vein, I try to use as plain language as possible and give concrete, but not like scary or intense examples. Like, you never want to overwhelm somebody, because that's kind of the crux of trauma, I've been told, is kind of trauma's too much too soon. So you ask a lot of questions, try to gauge where someone is at. And I mean, I don't do well reading facial expressions. I will straight up ask, does this make sense to you? Is this uncomfortable for you? Because we don't have to continue if it's making you uncomfortable. And I give them as much space to ask questions and things, like Connie said, to say no, as much space as I'm asking questions. And then being a self-advocate myself and having had these experiences, I try to be really open about the ways that being incredibly sheltered from these things have actually done me harm. Which is not to say that I go into like scary detail or anything, but as Connie said, a lot of the harms in these kinds of things come from ignorance, come from people wanting to people please, oh, I'm saying yes to this because it feels like what I'm supposed to do, and I don't know that it's bad, let alone that it should be like something that's a boundary. Things like that. And like bring attention to the fact that it's not only ignorance of these things, but having a stigma around these things and not being able to talk about them with folks we trust is actually where a lot of the harms to our lives, to our health and our mental health come from. Because even when our sexuality is perfectly normal and healthy and no one's hurting us, we still get treated like it's something we have to be silent about. It's not special, it's not sacred, it's not medicalized when I'm talking about it. It's just another part of life, because it is. And like Connie was saying, you might not know to reach out for help or to report something to someone because you don't understand that it's bad. Like I've had that experience, and you never ever want somebody to be in that position. I do a lot of talking, especially about boundaries to folks, about your body's your own. And even if like it's just a classmate, I'm a teacher, I'm sorry. Even if somebody's just coming up and poking you on the shoulder, you have bodily autonomy. And you are the boss of the whole thing. Like I hear a lot about squares and stuff, but it's like, no, it's your body, it's your life. And if something makes you uncomfortable or if something makes you comfortable, you have the right to express yourself.
Thank you, Micah. Rami?
I mean, I would just echo what Connie and Micah have already said. I think when I approach the feeling of taboo with parents and caregivers, I like to talk about the risk of not talking about it, which Connie and Micah have both talked about. And I was actually looking up some statistics yesterday when I was thinking through some of these questions, and found one study that talked about how approximately 80% of women and 30% of men with IDD have been sexually assaulted. And half of those women, so half of the 80%, have been assaulted more than 10 times. And I think that there is this massive epidemic of sexual abuse among folks with IDD, and it's something that's not talked about. And I think part of the reason it's not talked about is because of the whole taboo around sexuality for folks with IDD. And it's just so important, like Connie and Micah were saying, to provide the sex ed to these people so they know when someone's violating their consent, when someone's crossing a boundary, and also to protect them, because I'm sure a lot of us have worked with folks who have been labeled as sexual offenders because they don't understand, and no one has ever educated them on how to respect other people's boundaries or how to check for consent from other people. So there are just so many safety concerns on both sides. So I think there's just a giant risk in keeping silent about this and keeping it as a taboo.
And can I add something to that? Two things is that another thing we don't teach is the law, right? We don't teach what's legal and what's illegal. I've got so many calls, someone wants sex therapy. I'll say, okay, so what happened? He exposed himself out in the community. did he know that that was illegal? Now he's a sex offender because he didn't know that that was illegal when he, you know what I'm saying? So we got to teach the law as well for each state. And then the second thing, I think Dave talked before, we've been talking about language. I also work with the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office in a program called Project Shield. And, you know, I think there was a case where a young woman said she was raped. And so the question was asked, you know, or so did you say no? And she said, yes, I said no. So in the first attempt, she said no, but then she had hickeys all over her body. All over her body, she had hickeys. And she didn't say no to the hickeys. So the question I asked was, does she know that when she says no the first time, it doesn't cover, that no doesn't cover to the second or the third time? She needs to say no every time. Because sometimes we forget that, right? So she said no before in the living room, but now we're in the bedroom, that's a different place. But she's thinking it covers, it's an all-inclusive no, as opposed to a no, I need every single time that I mean no, I need to say no. So even in our teaching, we need to be concrete and explaining, right? The different acts. Okay, so I'm okay with this, but I need, if I don't like this, I need to say no for this one. It just doesn't cover the whole thing. So even in the teaching, we need to be concrete.
Yeah, because it's perfectly okay to say yes to hickeys. And that has nothing to do with saying yes to sex.
Absolutely.
So those are two entirely different things.
Right.
What I wanted to say in response to this as well was, Connie, I did a lot of work at YI over the years, as you know, and when I came to work for Vita, I actually stole from you guys. I knew Perry and
Barbara
really well. And anyways, one of the things that I admired about what your agency did was you established yourself as a sex positive organization from the get-go, and people were informed of that. And I think that that's really important. So we worked at our organization to establish ourselves in many different ways, but we're sex positive and we're disability positive in our organization. Our policies reflect that, and once those policies are in place, we're good. Do you know, I used to do these trainings back in the old days. It was called attitude training for staff, and we'd bring staff in and do that. I would never do those again. There's a waste of time. But nonetheless, staff would come in, and you know how when the instructor says all opinions are welcome here, that's never true. I mean, that's actually never true, okay? And there was a woman in one of my adjustment classes who said that in her country, they killed homosexuals, and that was fine by her. Now, I have to tell you, that's not a welcome attitude. And I did check it out, and I was really shocked at what I found. This woman had provided service to a lesbian woman and did so without judgment and was very supportive of her. And the lesbian woman felt very comfortable with her. She'd had a couple of other gay people come out to her, and she handled it all very well. So I actually went and spoke to her, and I said, I don't understand here. You're telling me that you're fine with, you know, homosexuals in your country being killed, and you agree with that attitude, yet you supported several LGBT people within your organization. And she said, I don't understand the conflict. And I said, why? And she said, at home, that's what I believe. At work, I follow policy.
Yes.
Yeah, points to that importance of policy, I think, of being clear. I said it points to that importance of agencies being clear.
Well, also, I don't do attitude stuff anymore because I don't care what their attitude is. I care that we have a policy in place and people follow the policy. Then I don't have to discuss your religion, and I don't have to discuss your culture. I don't have to discuss any of those things which are really inappropriate for me to discuss. I just need to discuss our policy, and are you willing to follow the policy? And if you violate the policy, do you understand what that is. So you guys, I think at YI were one of the few organizations at the very beginning, all those years ago, to develop a good positive policy, and we followed from that.
So I need to comment on this. I think I get what you're saying, Dave, but inevitably bias, what you discussed earlier, your own personal biases, while evoking them or asking for the expression of them may not be necessary. In many cases, the bias that you have does influence the way you follow policies and how you read them. And I think what you were just describing is something quite exceptional. I don't think that in most cases, a person who believes that people should be killed for homosexuality can successfully support somebody who's a lesbian just because they happen to be in a different country and that's the rule. I think what you just described is quite exceptional. And I do think that, as you described earlier, it is very important to know what your biases are. And if you have biases against people who are gay, then you should not be working with people who are gay. Rules or no rules, there should be a rule in my, at least it would be on my team, that if that is your bias, it is unacceptable to think that somebody should be killed for their sexuality in any culture and find that acceptable. So I would argue that what you just described is quite exceptional, but not the rule. And I'm wondering what other panelists think about my interrupting the the panel to say that, because I felt very strongly that that's not quite right, you know.
I just, before that, let me just say, I think you're probably right. However, what I think is important here is that we have very clear policy and the discussion be around policy and not about faith.
Absolutely.
We would never have found out what her attitude was if we weren't running these classes, which essentially were telling people that they needed to believe in a particular way, and that's not really the case. So I think the issue for me is how somebody behaves and how somebody performs. In that, I know people who are very sex positive for themselves and very sex negative for other people. So I think.
Right. So I wonder if the other panelists do have any thoughts on what we just discussed.
I would love to hear.
You know, in terms of bias, and bias is a word I would want to dissect. You may not agree with something that someone is a lifestyle of theirs, doesn't mean you're going to put your beliefs on them. And I don't think, and that's that kind of fine line. I think about people who are vegetarians, and I have a lot of friends who are vegetarians, and I'm not trying to downplay anything, but I'm an avid bacon eater and an avid.
Careful, I'm a vegetarian, sister.
Yes.
There you go.
I am an absolute carnivore. And when I go places with my friends who are vegetarians, I do not want them to tell me that I'm eating too much meat. That's my business. You eat your grass and I'll eat my meat. We can be
a vegetarian,
Yes, I know. Right. But we can sit at the same table and we can enjoy a meal, but we don't have to be eating the same thing. I don't have to believe in the whole don't eat. And I know I've seen all the videos. People have sent me
Yes, but if all vegetarians were killed in your country, that's a little bit, right? And you say, well, here in Brooklyn, I'll agree to have a vegetarian at the table. But at home in Massachusetts, they kill them. And I support that at home. That's a little extreme, wouldn't you say?
The killing is extreme. So I'm not talking about the killing part of it. The killing is extreme. I'm talking, which is why I said with the word bias, it's a difference of opinion. I don't have to agree with your lifestyle. That doesn't mean I want you dead. So the killing is extreme.
Right. We all have biases. So there's nothing wrong with the word bias. As long as the bias, as you said, doesn't impose on the other person. I absolutely agree. And what I was saying is you have to know what your biases are. So if you're eating dinner with a vegetarian and a carnivore, and you as a vegetarian cannot stand the sight of meat,
Right.
you have to know that. And you have to not come to dinner while the person's eating the burger, or come for dessert, or make some sort of an accommodation because you know that it is not acceptable to you. And that's what I'm saying. You kind of have to know how it affects you in order to make sure that you don't impose on the other person, right?
Right. And that's the thing with a policy, right? If you know, if your convictions are so strong that you just cannot, there's some things like masturbation. I've known people who have been, telling people with intellectual disabilities, you cannot masturbate, just like some parents will tell them. But parents is different from a staff. So if your conviction is so strong that it's going to come through in the way you support, then absolutely right. This is not the job for you. This is not the place for you. Maybe it's helping to fundraise for people with disabilities.
Yeah.
You can have a difference of opinion, a difference of lifestyle, and understanding that in this context, this is who I am, but in this context, this is what is required of me, and you can function accordingly in an authentic manner, because all people are people. We're all humans with different views and different lifestyles. And if that's the way you're looking at it, and that you're supporting another human to live the life they want, even though it's different from your personal choices, then that's okay. I see that as okay. I'm an immigrant. I dress differently. A lot of things about me are different. And I've experienced, discrimination on multiple layers, but also because I have an accent. You may not hear it right now, but in other cases, it is. And I see where people will look at me differently or think about me differently until they hear my qualification. Right? So it's in so many different ways. And I think it's your view. If you have the view that this is another human being and I'm supporting them, even though I may not agree with them, then I think you can work, right? It's like you said, if your convictions are so strong that you can't get past it, then it's not the place for you. It's not the right fit for you.
Right. So I think that points again to the importance of transparency and honesty to begin with. So I want to go ahead and move on to some other questions, just in the interest of time. So I'm going to pose this to start with Micah, I think. Or let's start with Rami. I think Micah went first last time. What do you believe is imperative for success in terms of promoting positive attitudes about sexual and gender identity? Things such as educating families, inclusive policies, knowing your rights, those kind of things.
I think one thing that I kind of take with me when I do my work with families and providers is the importance of building that strong positive rapport, and how people are going to be so much more likely to listen to what you say and take, your words into account if you have that relationship built with them. So I really like to focus on the relationship building aspect, in order to try to promote those positive attitudes. And I think there's also something to be said for the impact that having a relationship with someone who identifies as queer or transgender can have on other people. Like I've had, even in my own extended family, people change their minds about their attitudes about sexuality and gender identity because of knowing me and because of being like, oh, well, this is a person I like and trust. So I don't discount the impact of just kind of existing as a queer and trans person on promoting those positive attitudes with the people with the parents and caregivers that I work with. I think also, especially for parents, really creating like a non-judgmental space to hear their concerns and to just listen to them. And because it can be really difficult, especially if they feel like, oh, I'm worried you're gonna judge me for this, or you're gonna think I'm not progressive enough or whatever, just to try to create a space to non-judgmentally listen to them without shame and without, trying to make them feel like they're not woke enough or whatever. So I think, yeah, the most important thing for me is trying to start with those relationships, and then just, you know, kind of, so I like to do like education, I guess, very like holistically. Like I love doing like panels and trainings and stuff like that, but I just feel really passionately about the impact that can come from those like one-on-one personal relationships.
It's really important. Thank you, Amy. Micah, do you have some other comments on that?
I would like to agree with what Rami said about especially creating like a really open space that's like conducive to questions and just acknowledges that everybody is somewhere along in their own process of learning and unlearning, like learning new helpful things and unlearning all of the junk that we've been given by society. But in a similar vein, what I feel is really, really imperative in kind of creating more positive outcomes and providing more autonomy and safety for folks with IDD within their sexuality and expressions is helping people understand, especially families, that when I was young, so much was done under the guise of protecting me from the world that very little was given to me by way of tools for protecting myself. You cannot control, as a parent, other people. You cannot control your child. And someone with bad faith intentions is going to have those bad faith intentions regardless. But what you have the power to do is give your child the skills and the tools to recognize these situations and to act, to get themselves to safety. I think there's a level of trust involved in that. And I think that it takes a lot of grieving and a lot of really sitting with what is on your heart in terms of what you want for your kid, what your kid wants for their life. It takes a lot of reflection because, as Connie and some other folks have said earlier, there's a lot of fear here. And it's not unfounded. As Rami gave us those statistics, you know, so many people face sexual abuse. And that happened to me. Like, I learned the hard way in a lot of ways about sexuality. I was very, very fortunate in my situation with gender to meet other non-binary people. And I had carried this feeling with me for a really long time that I didn't understand what made someone a boy or a girl. And that's why neither of them resonated with me. I didn't know that some people aren't a boy or a girl. And that, like, I lived most of my life thinking that something was wrong with me, thinking that something that I had done wrong sexually, like, gave me these feelings. Or maybe, like, I just would feel like a real woman if I did X, Y, and Z, or if I had proper education or what have you. And to Rami's point about having really positive and open, like, rapport in relationships, you as a parent can build that, and you can help, as a service provider, you can help parents build that with their kids. Fear doesn't have to be the center of this conversation and the result of it, I think, is my point here. We can take things from a much more proactive and positive place just by accepting the fact that no one can be protected or cured of human nature. Mm-hmm. And that it's not knowing these things or not understanding these things that often cause the harm, and doing the work to see how that plays out in our own lives.
Right, and acknowledging fear, but also I think I hear you all saying that one way to remedy that is to provide information, right? Without the information, it even becomes scarier, and there's more to be. Like, people don't have the information they need.
Yeah, you can't protect someone from the world, but you can arm them with knowledge.
Right.
Yeah, I think I would also just want to jump in and add really quickly, like for like the fear thing, like I want parents to also be empowered and know that there are things that they can do to help facilitate those positive outcomes for their kids who might identify as LGBTQ. Like I saw this study that came out the other week that talked about how just using the pronouns of a transgender person decreases the risk of suicide. So like just referring to your kid the way they want to be referred makes it less likely for them to attempt suicide. And, you know, there are all sorts of statistics about how acceptance and support like contributes to positive outcomes and less like lower rates of mental illness and all of those things. So I know there's like a lot of fear in wanting to like protect your kid, but there are so many things that parents and caregivers and providers as well can do to try to help boost those positive outcomes for individuals.
So we've kind of.
Can I just jump in here too? I think one of the things we also need to do is move away from sexuality as always being the subject of heavy discussion, you know, and focus on joy and on celebration and on pride and all those sorts of things, because other than that, I think it just starts to get everybody weighed down. And like I said, in our first Gay Pride March, there was such celebration there within the group that attended, both staff and people with disabilities, and within over the course of time in our organization, we have for Valentine's Day, we helped several couples of all sorts have a romantic night out, renting limousines and doing joyous things to celebrate their relationships. So yeah, I understand we face all these other things, but I think we have to keep punching that this is about joy, and this is about happiness, and this is about people living the life that they want to lead, and I think that matters. And so when we tell stories of people with disabilities who are in relationships, or people with disabilities who have reconciled with who they are in whatever the way, that's celebratory. And I think we need to just remember that as well.
Thank you. And I think that, you know, that resonates with START. And we talk a lot with our START programs about the concept of PERMA and, you know, positive emotions, engagement, and relationships. And I think to see the development of sexuality or interest in other people, of having intimate relationships, like you said, Dave, is a developmental thing that happens, and that's a good thing that happens. And that's part of somebody achieving PERMA in their own life, to have relationships, to have meaning, to really have those positive emotions and experience joy. So maybe trying to reframe that development in terms of a positive thing for the person is a good place to start. So we kind of, we may have already gotten into this question a little bit, but I wondered if you had more specific strategies in terms of building that trust and having discussions with families or service providers. Some of you touched on it a little bit, but I didn't know if you have any other suggestions around that question.
No, I you know, as a parent, like I said, there's a natural fear, right? And I think sometimes as providers, we forget that there is no book. There are many books that have been written, but there really is not a book that teaches you how to be that perfect parent. There is no perfect parent. So, you know, for many of us, we've learned it through experience in the field, from working with people. So we need to educate the parents as well, right? They may not know, and creating that safe environment for them to ask questions, for them to get information. How are we sharing it with them? Because there is the fear, you know, if someone is in therapy, the parent can come in as well, as long as it's okay with that person who's in therapy, maybe to meet, to, you know, to have that conversation or to start that conversation. Are there books? Are there apps? Are there, you know, how can we help to give the parent education that is not, because sometimes parents see service providers as the enemy, right? My child was fine and they came to you and now they want to do all this stuff. You put this nonsense in their heads with all your fine degrees and stuff. Y'all did it. And they were feeling that way all the time, you know. So I think it is so important that we create an atmosphere where parents can feel as comfortable as possible. It's not going to be comfortable. And starting young. So I know if you get the opportunity to go into people's homes, if their books, do the children books have children in there with disability, have children, you know, young children who have, you know, different sexual identity. There are books that are out there. How early are we introducing the concept so that difference isn't seen as wrong or bad? Difference is seen, you know, difference is cool. You know, difference is okay. Difference is a strength. Difference is what makes you interesting. It's not something to be afraid of. It's just who that person is. But I believe parents need to be coached and taught and given material and feel okay to ask, you know, and don't think that they'll be yelled at or seen as weird. And then if we teach staff, then staff will be able to have that interaction. But I've seen many times where there's a person who is sexually consenting and wants to be in a relationship, but is afraid of what their parents will say and will actually sacrifice themselves to not be in that relationship because they don't want the parent to be upset with them. But in the residence will want to then hang out and do stuff. You know, that's a difficult place to be because we know we never win against parents, right? That bond between a parent and a child, even when you don't answer the phone or you don't want to talk to them or you're just annoyed with them, it's still your parent. If somebody says they're going to do something to your mama, you're going to fight, right? That's just fighting words. So I think giving them that the knowledge, helping them to see the child as happy. Every parent wants their child to be happy. And helping them to see that this is something that helps them to be happy. You know, and it's hard. Keep chipping away at it. It's going to take a while for some parents.
Yeah, thank you, Connie. And I'm wondering, Ramey, I was thinking particularly about you in terms of your work as a START coordinator, well, now as a team lead, but you know, working with families and also recognizing that that usually sometimes there's extended family too. There may be siblings and other people in that person's family, not just the parents. And are there strategies or ways that you've worked within family systems to help create greater understanding?
Cool. It's so interesting down here in North Carolina because I feel like there is such a dichotomy politically, and that kind of translates into how people tend to view LGBTQ issues and things, and even being sex positive and like all of that. So like I've worked with families who, when I walk in the door, they're like, "So what are your pronouns?" And I'm like, "Oh my gosh, this is incredible." And then I work with families who are visibly uncomfortable because I don't look straight or I don't look how they might expect, and so I feel like it's my experience has often been like either there are families who are already like, "Oh yeah, like so this is the setup I have for my son when he needs to masturbate, and like we've gotten him these tools and we've given him this education, and oh, we want to make sure that he understands, you know, what your pronouns are, so we've educated him on people of different gender identities." And I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I like don't need to do anything." And then there are families that are like don't know how to talk about this at all, feel very uncomfortable, may have strong religious beliefs that inform their perspective on LGBTQ identities. So I feel like you kind of have to be a little bit of a jack of all trades. I mean, I feel like that's like an NC STAR coordinator anyways. You have to be able to kind of meet people where they are, and it could be so many different places. But I think for the families who may kind of, when I walk into a home and I feel like, oh, this doesn't feel like a safe space for me, like that feels hard to me because I kind of have to check myself and I have to put like my own feelings and stuff like kind of to the side. And I think with families like that, I really try to do what I was talking about previously with that like positive relationship building Maybe they've never known a person who identifies the way that I do, and maybe, you know, just kind of knowing that I'm there for them and I'm there for their kid, and just kind of showing that I have that like unconditional positive regard for them and for their child, and that I'm going to be reliable and I'm going to show up. That kind of goes a really long way to then being more open to hearing what I might have to say about things like sexuality and gender. I don't really know that I have like a specific like set of like recommendations or techniques, because I really kind of feel it out like person by person, but I might I've connected families in the past with like the LGBT center in Raleigh, and like talked about different like parent groups, or groups that their kid might be able to even go to or participate in. I've sent out like different websites or different pamphlets or things, but it really kind of depends on where they're at. I don't know.
I was also thinking sexuality in general, and sometimes engaging siblings who might have a little different perspective, or you know, or have gone through the normal developmental processes and are saying, well, this is my sibling, they're going through the same things I did, that you know, that we're experiencing sexuality when we're, you know, teenagers. So I just wonder sometimes if we could, other parts of the system or other members of the family might also be an avenue to kind of change attitudes or create different understanding.
Yeah, I think it's really important to normalize experiences as much as possible. So I really like what you're saying about bringing in the sibling, and like, oh, like you went through puberty or you wanted to start dating. Like that's really similar to what your sibling might be feeling. Yeah, I think that's really important.
Micah, do you have any other ideas around that issue?
I think most of it has been said very well. But to Connie's point about surrounding, you know, creating an environment that has appropriate materials like books and things that are inclusive of all the different ways that there are to be human. Welcomingschools.org has a list. Again, that's welcomingschools.org. They have fabulous resources there. Our school has been through all of their welcoming schools trainings. They do these are trainings for educators about creating more inclusive spaces and doing the work of checking your biases and making sure that those don't come into how you interact with your students, or in this case, the people that you're serving. And just like they also have a glossary of plain language definitions of basically ways to explain non-binary, intersex, genderqueer, what have you, to kids or to folks with disabilities. I really recommend that resource because just like Dave and Connie and folks have said, we kind of have to divest this area of life of all the mysticism and fear that has surrounded it, and get people to understand that this is just a part of life. So those are some great resources that you can go to for those.
Thank you, Micah.
Can I add something in here?
Yeah, real quick, a couple more questions.
I just wanted to, I took my master's in feminist approaches to counseling and therapy. And one of the things that I remember from it the most is a concept which has really affected all of the work that I do. And that is never do work for your client that belongs to them. And that's such an important idea. Like I used to go and talk to parents about the sexuality of their children and their children wanting to be in relationships and do that. And I don't do that anymore. What I do is work with their child to give them the skills and abilities and the strength and the confidence to talk to their parents themselves. Mm-hmm. That's their conversation. I shouldn't be having it. Why is a stranger coming in and talking to you, a parent, about the sexuality, the most intimate part of their child? And we've had so much success because it's really easy for a parent to look at me and say, my kid will never be in a relationship. And it's a very different thing to look in the eyes of a child that has said to you that I want somebody to love me and I want to love somebody else, for them to say that same thing to their child. So I think sometimes we get in the way of the relationship with the parents, and we forget that the person with a disability is our first and best ally in working with their parents.
Yeah.
And I've gone with people to do that with their parents, just to provide them support. But it can be astonishing to see the conversation happening when their parent is actually faced with a child saying, "This is what I want for my life. Please help me get this."
Very good point. Thank you, Dave. So I want to, before we've got about 15 minutes left, I want to talk about this term, dignity of risk. And we've kind of hit on this a little bit as we've gone through the conversation. That term is used a lot when talking about self-determination with people with IDD. So trying to think about what that means in terms of this conversation about sexual and gender identity, that term dignity of risk. Micah, do you want to start?
Yes, the dignity of risk means that you give your loved one the opportunity to take risks, that you don't treat them like you know what's best for them. We often think about freedom, especially in this community, as freedom from, like freedom from harm, freedom from poverty, freedom from all of the things that can happen to one when you have disabilities and depend on systems for things. But there's also freedom too. And if you never have a chance to try something that may not go well for you, you're missing out both on something that might actually go well and be a very good thing for you. And if it doesn't go well, it's an opportunity to learn, which is also a good thing. The dignity of risk is all about that. And it's about letting your kid know that no matter what, you are there for them, that they'll always have a place to go, even if things don't go right or they do mess up. Because you won't always be there. And there's a kind of learned helplessness that can grow when you grow up and everyone is doing everything for you because they assume that you can't.
Mm-hmm. And I think, Micah, when we had a discussion before a couple of weeks ago, the other thing we talked about, and we've talked about this earlier, is dignity of risk. That an important element of that is what we talked about before about information, right? Mm-hmm. So given the right information, then people can make choices, and that dignity of risk is there, right?
Yeah, about giving people everything they need to make an informed choice, to make a choice that's right for them, regardless of what you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
And there is also the primary right to make a mistake.
Yes.
Right.
And have it be just a mistake, not a reason to take all of my rights away from me for the rest of my life. It's just a mistake, for God's sakes. Oh, sorry, for heaven's sakes.
Yeah, exactly.
I was just gonna say that, Dave, and again, like the same context of holding people to a higher esteem than we do ourselves is where we think they can't make a mistake. A mistake is a behavior plan, right? Mm-hmm. When we think about ourselves, then we should be on a whole lot of behavior plans, right? Considering how many mistakes we have made, and mistakes generally in life, and mistakes in romantic situations as well. We somehow think that people with IDD are supposed to be perfect. We're supposed to teach them and they get it right away, when they have the right, like everybody else, to make mistakes. And that's what it is, the opportunity to explore and try something different, to fail at it and laugh at it. No, you won't do it again. It becomes something, you know, I met up with my high school friends and we laughed about some really ridiculous things that we did, you know, but having those memories and knowing that it's okay.
Yeah. Thank you. And
can I say something about this too? I think one of the things that's very important in this is it isn't so much that we want people with IDD to be perfect. It's that we don't believe they have resilience. We don't believe that they have the ability, because of their disability, to tolerate the mistakes or these risks. And so what we try to do is protect them. It's very paternalistic as a society. I don't think it's that we want them to be perfect. It's, I think we don't really feel like there's a lot of room for error in people who are already disabled. And that it's that underestimation, that inability to promote resilience that we've all been talking about. And all of these things, education, support, acknowledging people's liberties, giving them their opportunity for dignity, these are the things that build resilience and actually allow people to take those risks. And so there's an intersectionality between all of the concepts when we talk about dignity of risk. And I think it's really important, because I think a lot of people in the room don't really believe we expect people to be better than us or perform better than we, but we don't feel like they have room for error. And that's where it becomes an issue, especially if you love the person. I'm a family member. I have a sister with ID who became sexually active in the 60s, which was the time where everyone was supposed to be sexually active, but she had ID. And she ended up getting married and having a child. And it was a very difficult, the family was fearful, not that she shouldn't have the opportunity, but that her life would be over. And I do think that we have to have empathy and support families and educate them as well. So.
Thank you, Joni. And I think that, you know, we talked about transparency, information is power. And I think that goes along with this, providing people the skills they need and so that they can become resilient and people may be less fearful about them making those mistakes.
Well, I think we also have to realize something is that the disabled people have made it to adulthood and therefore resilience has been proven over and over and over and over again. They have faced barrier after barrier after barrier. They have faced prejudice after prejudice after prejudice. They've faced abuse after abuse after abuse, and they still stand in front of us all.
Yes.
We need to give.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Micah.
Oh, I was just gonna say, as a self-advocate, like Dave said, and like Joni said, I was getting messages both implicit and explicit from everyone around me, meaning both they were saying with their words, we think that might be too much for you, and they were being nice to me, but setting up my life in a way that it was telling me I can't have many opportunities. And I've been to a lot of IL classes, I've done a lot of therapy, but nothing in this world has been empowering or as helpful to me as making my own mistake and discovering that I survived. Mm-hmm. And it didn't go as bad as I thought that it would, or that everyone told me that it would. It's truly healing.
Thank you, Micah. So we've just got a few minutes, and I want to just allow the panel members to say, maybe leave us with one last thought if you want to. Micah, is there anything else you want to make sure we all hear before we leave?
I think that was it. That was it. The dignity of risk, yeah, and the ability to make my own mistakes and discover my resilience for myself. Yeah, I think that needs to be a tool in the toolbox.
Thank you. That was great.
For everyone.
Rami, you have any last words?
Yeah, I think I'm just going to take a moment of vulnerability here and just kind of name the fact that there's something inherently sort of difficult as like a autistic, queer, trans person, like sitting here putting, like having this, even having to have this discussion about like my sexuality, my gender identity, disability things. Like people without disabilities don't have their sexuality up for debate. People who aren't queer or trans don't have their lives up for debate. And so I think there's something like, I don't know exactly what my point is, but I sort of want to name like, this is really kind of difficult. Like I'm excited to be part of this, but it's also difficult to feel like, oh, this is something that has to be discussed because people aren't supporting this, or people aren't on board with this, or people think my lifestyle is wrong or whatever. So I think I just want the folks listening here today to like think about that and kind of reflect on the ways in which your identities may not be up for debate or may not be the topic of a panel discussion, and kind of the privilege that's inherent in that. So I don't know, I think that's just something that I would like the folks here today to kind of reflect on a little bit.
Thank you. A very good point. And actually this morning at one point, Dave said just that training is completely unnecessary. We should just be treating each other as human beings. So I think, you know, like, yeah, so it's a very good point, something to ponder. Thank you, Remy. Connie, do you have any kind of last thoughts?
I'm sure. I'm going to come from the viewpoint of providers, that we should do less talking and more listening. Mm-hmm. Remember that it's not our lives. And I think this was on Dave, you open future learning, right? It's your job, but it's their life. Mm-hmm. If we could just keep remembering that, yes, it's my job, and my job is to help this person to live their best life, which means I need to hear what that is for that person.
Thank you so much, Connie. So Joni, do you have any other final words as we're ending?
I just think this was an outstanding panel, and Remy, I think what you said was extremely important. And I also think that, you know, when I think about when my sister got married and when I got married, when my sister was planning on getting married, there was like a family meeting and a discussion. When I said I was getting married, everyone was relieved. So, so I mean, it's a very different, you're absolutely right. The fact that we're having this discussion means that we really need to self-reflect. And I love the idea that you incorporated the concept of privilege, that we should not forget that there are structural mechanisms that allow some people to have privilege and rights still that others still do not have. And we demonstrated that today. So, but I appreciate all of the panelists. Dave, I can listen to you for the next 30 years. I've been listening to you for 30, and I'm willing to go till I'm in my 90s, Dave. I'm up for it. And I just want to thank you all, and thank Jill, and thank you all for this opportunity.
Yes, thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you, Dave, Micah, Connie, Remy, and Jill, for all of your contributions and your expertise and perspective today. And thank you everybody for coming and joining us. This is the close of the day. The evaluation link was sent in the chat, and registrants will also receive an email with a link, and the evaluation link is also on our event webpage. Certificates of attendance, which include UNH CEUs, are also available on the webpage. Tomorrow's session, day 3, is for START team members only, and so the Zoom link is different. Those registered for tomorrow's session will receive an email 1 hour prior with the Zoom link.
And before we end, can we all go on screen and applaud the wonderful Beth Grasso, our Director of Training, who organized this entire event in the last 2 days. We thank you, Beth, and the support team, Mary Ann, Anne Marie, Shannon. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We couldn't do it without you. Thank you.
And I want to introduce my husband. He does really exist.
Hey, Joe.
Joe.
He's not a figment of my imagination. Yeah, I know from why I.
Yeah.
Borrow him for a while. Yeah.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Take good care.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.